The phone rang just as Frank Murphy was about to finally eat dinner. The policeman looked at his watch, almost 11 p.m., and sighed heavily. The lasagna heated up in the microwave remained untouched. Frank rubbed his eyes tiredly and answered, "Murphy." His voice sounded hoarse after 2 days without proper sleep. "Murder on Oak Street, 45, apartment 8, the desk clerk said without preamble. Female, early 50s, gunshot wound. The fatigue that had haunted Frank for the past few days seemed to recede into the background. Oak Street was a low-income neighborhood, but it was a quiet one, mostly inhabited by workers and small clerks. Murders were rare in such places. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he answered and hung up. He looked at his reflection in the kitchen window, a 44-year-old man with a tired face and early graying in his blonde hair. The wrinkles around his eyes showed a history of 20 years of service, first in the army, then in the police force. Murphy pulled a bottle of pills from the cabinet, swallowed one, and drank cold coffee. The pain in his back from his injury in Iraq hadn't gone away, and neither had the memories. The shabby Ford didn't start the first time Murphy cursed, and mentally promised himself he'd finally get to work on the car over the weekend, even though he knew he'd probably spend the weekend in the paperwork department. Since his divorce 3 years ago, work had been his only anchor. Laura had taken his daughter and moved to Chicago, leaving him with an empty house and the Wednesday therapy sessions he attended on occasion. Oak Street greeted him with the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. A couple of gawkers stood in the driveway despite the late hour. News of the accident had spread quickly, as it usually did in small towns. Frank showed his badge to the young officer guarding the entrance and went up to the second floor. Apartment number 8 was typical of the neighborhood. 2 small rooms, kitchen, bathroom. A few women's clothes hung on a rack near the entrance. A raincoat, a scarf, a tattered handbag. The odors of cheap perfume and blood mingled in the air. The body lay in the living room, near the couch. A woman, apparently in her 50s with neatly trimmed brown hair, wearing a house robe over a nightgown. The bullet had gone straight through her chest, the red stain on the fabric blurring to form an irregular circle. Frank squatted down next to the body. Judging by the position, the woman had died almost immediately. A broken cup with the remains of tea was lying next to her. "Have you been able to establish anything?" he asked the CSI, a young lad examining the room. "Jane Foster, 53 years old," he answered, still on the job. "Front desk clerk at the Pine Tree Motel. Found by a neighbor around 9:30. Shot at close range, no weapon found yet." Frank looked around the room. It was sparse but tidy. A worn sofa, an old armchair, a coffee table, shelves with books and a couple of framed photographs. One of them showed a younger woman, apparently the same Jane, standing next to a middle-aged man. They were smiling. The photo had been taken somewhere outdoors. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry. "Who called it in?" Frank asked, continuing to look around the room. "A neighbor, Betty Williams. She's from across the hall. Heard a gunshot, knocked, then called the police. She's waiting in her apartment." Frank nodded and headed for the bedroom. There was a neatly made bed, a closet full of things, a dresser, an open book on the nightstand, and another photograph of the same couple, only older. On the dresser were several vials of medicine. Murphy picked up one of them, a hormone drug with a hard-to-pronounce name. As he walked back down the hallway, he noticed the phone on the wall. The indicator light on the answering machine was blinking. One new message. Frank pressed the button and heard a man's voice. "Hello, Jane, it's Alex. I'm back in town and I think we need to talk. I'll be at your place around 8. Alex. The name reminded Frank of something vaguely. He turned back to the pictures in the living room. If the woman in the photo was Jane, the man was probably her husband. He didn't see any other photos where Alex could be. Frank left the apartment and knocked on the next door. Betty Williams turned out to be a short woman in her 60s with a worried expression on her face. She nervously fidgeted with the hem of her colorful robe and kept shifting her gaze from Frank to the door of the next apartment. "Mrs. Williams? Lieutenant Murphy. I'd like to ask you a few questions." She nodded and invited him in. Betty's apartment was similar to the one next door in layout, but much more cluttered. There were porcelain figurines and souvenirs everywhere, and many photographs hanging on the walls. "Tell me what happened," Frank asked, sitting down in the offered chair. I was watching a TV show when I heard a loud pop, Betty began, nervously fixing her hair. I didn't think much of it at first, thinking it was someone slamming a door or dropping something. Then I heard the front door slam in the entryway. 15 minutes later, I went to take out the trash and saw Jane's door ajar. I called out to her, but no one answered. I looked in, and the woman trembled, and I saw her on the floor in blood. Frank gave her time to calm down and continued. Did you know Mrs. Foster well? We lived next door for almost 7 years since she moved here with her husband. After he died, she was left here alone. Her husband died? Yes, about 5 years ago, a car accident on the highway. Howard was a good man, worked as an auto mechanic. He had a son from his first marriage, Alex. Guy left before the accident. He and Jane didn't get along. Alex's name came up again. Frank remembered the message on the answering machine. And how long ago was the last time you saw this Alex? About 9 years ago. He left after a big fight with his father. Howard was very upset. Frank mentally noted the coincidence. Alex comes back to town after years away, leaves a message saying he'll be there at 8, and around 9:30, his stepmother's body is discovered. What can you tell us about Jane herself? Betty hesitated for a moment, then spoke up. She was strange, always very reserved, closed off. You know, in the 7 years I lived next door, I learned very little about her. Jane never talked about her past before her marriage to Howard. She had almost no friends, just work and home. Sometimes she'd go away for a couple days and say she was visiting relatives, but she never invited them over. Also, Betty lowered her voice even though they were alone. I always thought Jane was hiding something. Hiding? What was it? I don't know exactly. Just a feeling. Sometimes I'd see her taking some kind of medication, but she never talked about being sick. And then there's the regular trips to the doctor's office in the next town. Why go there when we have our own hospital? Frank made a note in his notebook. Maybe none of this means anything, but it was worth checking. Do you know if she had any conflicts with anyone? Or maybe she's been afraid of something lately? No, I haven't noticed. Although... Betty frowned as she thought back. I saw her talking to a man in the driveway yesterday. They were talking quite intensely, but I couldn't hear what they were talking about. Can you describe this man? Tall, dark hair, mid-30s. I've never seen him before. The description could fit hundreds of people, but combined with the message on the answering machine, it could point to Alex. After leaving Betty's, Frank returned to the crime scene. Forensics were finishing their work. Jane's body had already been taken away. He took another thorough look around the apartment, but found nothing new. The gun used in the shooting was nowhere to be found. The murderer had either taken it with him or thrown it away on the road. Suddenly, a young officer appeared in the doorway. Lieutenant, there's a man down there demanding to be let in. Says he's Alex Foster, the stepson of the murdered woman. Frank went downstairs and saw a tall man arguing vehemently with a policeman at the cordon tape. Dark hair, strong build, tattered leather jacket. He looked tired and angry. Mr. Foster? Frank approached him, stepping closer. I'm Lieutenant Murphy, in charge of the investigation. May I speak with you? Alex turned sharply toward him. There was tension in his eyes. What happened to Jane? I was told she was shot, is that true? Frank noted not grief, but rather surprise in the man's voice. Yes, I'm afraid it is. How long have you been back in town, Mr. Foster? This afternoon, Alex ran a hand through his hair. I called her, wanted to stop by and talk to her. What time were you expecting to arrive? Around 8, but I couldn't. I got stuck at a bar meeting an old friend. Called her to cancel, but she didn't answer. I thought I'd stop by now and there's... He pointed at the police cars. Frank stared at him intently. His story sounded plausible, but something about Alex's behavior was alarming. I take it you haven't spoken to your stepmother in a while? Almost 9 years. Alex's face darkened. We didn't get along. I left when my father married her. I came back when I heard about his death, but I was late for the funeral. Jane wouldn't even talk to me then. And why did you decide to come back now? Alex hesitated, as if not wanting to answer the question. I decided that it was time to mend relations. It's family, you know. Frank realized that wasn't the whole truth. There were plenty of times in 9 years you could have mended relations if you really wanted to. You're gonna have to stay in town a while, Mr. Foster. I'll need to talk to you in more detail. Sure, Alex nodded. I'm staying at a motel at the entrance to the city. I'm not going anywhere. Frank watched Alex leave and felt that the story was just beginning. Too many oddities and coincidences. A secretive woman, strange medications, a strained relationship with a stepson who suddenly returned after a long absence. He pulled out his cigarettes, lit a cigarette, and looked up at the night sky. The investigation promised to be challenging, but Frank Murphy didn't like easy cases. One thing he had learned in 20 years of service was that everyone had secrets, and sometimes those secrets can be deadly. The morning greeted Frank Murphy with the nasty ringing of his alarm clock and a headache. He struggled to open his eyes and looked at his watch. 6 in the morning. Too early for a normal person, and too late for someone who had gone to bed only 3 hours ago. After the discovery of Jane Foster's body, he had spent several more hours at the crime scene, and then spent half the night going over the details of the murder in his head, trying to grasp some strange, elusive thought. Frank got out of bed with difficulty. The apartment greeted him with its usual silence and disorder. On the desk lay a folder with the Foster case files he had started, which he had taken with him. Frank's first order of business was to go over again the notes he had made yesterday after his conversation with Alex Foster. The meeting with the stepson of the murdered woman had left a strange impression. Alex didn't seem particularly saddened, rather surprised and annoyed. His explanation for not showing up at the appointed time seemed plausible, but something in his behavior alarmed Frank. The overly abrupt movements, the running gaze, the nervousness. Of course, such a reaction could have been caused by the shock of the news of the murder, but still. After taking a shower and drinking coffee, Frank went over the crime scene photos again. The hormones he'd found in Jane's apartment kept him on edge. Why would a woman of 53 years of age take such medication? And why was she traveling to a doctor in another town, as neighbor Betty Williams had mentioned? Frank's first order of business was to visit the Pine Motel where Jane worked. This small, time-worn, 2-story building on the edge of town had seen better days back in the 70s. Now it was mostly used by truckers and the occasional transit traveler who didn't have enough money for something better. At the front desk sat a young girl with a tired face and bright red dyed hair. When she saw the police badge, she straightened nervously. "What can I do for you, officer?" "Lieutenant Murphy," Frank introduced himself. "I'm investigating the murder of Jane Foster. You two work together?" The girl had gone noticeably pale. "Yeah, I'm Carol, Jane's sub. We found out yesterday. It's just awful. Who would do such a thing?" "That's what I'm trying to find out. How long have you known Mrs. Foster?" "About 3 years since I came to work here. She was a senior administrator, taught me everything." "What was she like?" Frank watched Carol's face, trying to notice the slightest change in her facial expression. Quiet, calm, always very punctual and organized. Customers loved her, even though she wasn't much of a talker. Jane just did her job and stayed out of other people's business. The girl was quiet for a moment, then added, "And she never talked about her life. In 3 years, all I learned was that she was a widow and lived alone." "What about her past, before she started working here?" Carol shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing. I don't even know where she's from. I asked once, but Jane was a little miffed and changed the subject. I didn't ask again. I could tell she was uncomfortable." "Was there anything strange about her behavior? Maybe someone coming to see her, threatening her?" "No, nothing like that, although..." Jane had received a letter about a month ago. It came here to the motel. I happened to see the return address, something from Arizona. Jane was very upset when she read it. I asked if it was okay, but she just said it was an old, unpleasant memory. Frank made a note in his notebook. Arizona. Perhaps that's where Jane was from. Or had something happened there that she wanted to forget? "What about meds? Was Jane on any medication?" Carol raised her eyebrows in surprise. "How do you know?" "Yes, she took some pills on a regular basis. Never said what they were, but always at the same time. And sometimes she took time off to go to the doctor's office in Ridgewood. She said they were routine checkups. Ridgewood's a town about 50 miles from here. Strange to drive that far for routine medical checkups. This coincided with information from Betty's neighbor about Jane's regular trips to another town. Thanking Carol, Frank decided to check where Alex Foster was staying. Yesterday, the man had mentioned a motel near the entrance to town. It was a logical place to check his alibi about meeting up with an old buddy. The roadside motel was even more shabby than the Pine Tree Motel. The receptionist, an older man with a dull expression, confirmed without much enthusiasm that Alex Foster had indeed checked in yesterday afternoon, went out in the evening, came back late. "Did you notice the state he was in when he returned?" Frank asked. "Normal," the receptionist shrugged. "Not drunk, if that's what you mean. He looked a little woozy, but nothing more than that." After that, Frank went to Joe's bar, which Alex had mentioned as a place to meet his buddy. The bar had just opened, and there were hardly any customers. Behind the bar, a stout man of about 45 with a thick black beard, mottled with gray and tattoos on his arms, was wiping glasses. "Police?" he asked, not even waiting for Frank to show his badge. "Lieutenant Murphy, you Tom Riley?" "That's right." The bartender set his glass down and crossed his arms over his chest. "If this is about Jane, I've heard it before. It's a lousy story." "Did you know her well?" Tom shrugged. "Depends on what you call well. We knew each other before she married Howard, but we were never close friends." "How did you know her?" The bartender seemed a little tense. "We met in Albuquerque about 20 years ago. I was working in a bar back then, and she came in from time to time." "Albuquerque? Is that in New Mexico?" Frank pretended to clarify, but inwardly noted the discrepancy. If the letter came from Arizona, why was Jane in New Mexico? "Yes, she lived there for a while." Tom continued wiping glasses, but his movements became more abrupt. "Then she left. The next time I met her, she was here with Howard." "And you never discussed your past together?" Tom shook his head negatively. "No, she didn't like to talk about that time at all. Neither did I. Everyone has their own skeletons in the closet, Lieutenant. By the way, was Alex Foster here last night? He said he was meeting up with some old buddy." Tom frowned. "Alex? Yeah, he was. Came in around 7, sat with Nick Taylor. They were at school together, if I remember correctly. They left about 10:30. That matches Alex's story and the time of the murder. If Jane was shot around 9 and Alex was here before 10:30, he couldn't be the killer. But Frank decided to check that one too." "Are you sure about the time?" "More or less," Tom answered. "I'm not in the habit of keeping track of every visitor, but the TV was on, there was a basketball game on, third quarter. So yeah, about 10:30. Frank made a note to check exactly what time last night's game was broadcast. "What about Alex himself? He didn't ask you about Jane? Did he say why he was back in town?" "No, we barely spoke. He came in, said hi, sat down with Nick. They were talking quietly in the corner. I wasn't listening." "One more question, Mr. Riley. What do you know about Jane's background, about her life before Albuquerque?" Tom hesitated, his eyes darting away for a moment. "Nothing specific. I think she mentioned growing up out west. Maybe Arizona or California. I don't remember exactly." Frank sensed that Tom wasn't telling the truth. Something in his demeanor betrayed an underlying nervousness. "Mr. Riley, this is a murder investigation. If you know anything about Jane Foster that might make a difference, you'd better tell me now." Tom put down the towel and sighed heavily. "Look, I really don't know much. Jane in Albuquerque was different, more withdrawn, kept to herself. Sometimes she'd come to the bar, sit alone, barely spoke. Then suddenly she disappeared, and years later I met her here with her husband, and she hardly recognized me. All she said was, 'Tom, that time is long gone. It's better not to remember.' And that was it? Nothing else out of the ordinary?" Tom ran his hand nervously over his beard. "Well, there was something. This is going to sound strange, but I knew her by another name in Albuquerque. She introduced herself as Jane Parker, not Wilson, as in her marriage papers. And also," he lowered his voice, "she was kind of twitchy, always looking around, like she was afraid to meet someone. Once I asked her who she was hiding from, and she said something like, 'From her past.'" Frank made another note. Jane had changed last names before she got married, lived in different states, was nervous, like she was hiding from someone. The picture was getting more and more confusing. Leaving the bar, Frank decided to find Nick Taylor, who Alex had met with yesterday. Maybe he could shed some light on the purpose of Alex's return to town. Nick worked at a machine shop on the other side of town. Frank found him underneath an old Chevy repairing the undercarriage. Seeing the cop's badge, the mechanic wiped his hands with a rag and straightened up. "What can I do for you, officer?" "Did you meet Alex Foster at Joe's bar last night?" "Yeah, we're old friends, haven't seen each other in about 8 years. Nick nodded. "He called, said he was in town, suggested we meet for a drink. What happened?" "His stepmother, Jane Foster, was shot in her apartment yesterday," Frank said bluntly, watching the mechanic's reaction. Nick looked genuinely shocked. "Shit, really? Wow. Alex said he wanted to meet with her, but no mention of the murder. Did he tell you why he was back in town?" "Didn't really go into detail. Said he'd gotten some information about his stepmother, something he was really worried about. Wanted to get to the bottom of it himself. He never really got along with Jane, if that's what you mean." "This information, did he mention what exactly he'd found out?" Nick shook his head. "No," was very evasive. But I'd never seen him so tense. Alex had always been a pretty calm guy, and here it was like he was on pins and needles. He kept looking at his watch in a hurry. Said he'd arranged to meet Jane at 8, but then called her to cancel. Something about he needed to prepare for the conversation. "He called in front of you?" "Yeah, but she didn't answer." He left a message on the answering machine. It matched the message Frank heard at Jane's apartment. "What time exactly did you two break up?" Around 9:30. I was about to leave, and he said he'd stay a little longer." Frank paused, evaluating the information. So Tom Riley saw Alex and Nick leave, but Nick claims he left alone and Alex stayed behind. Interesting discrepancy. "And where did he go after the bar?" Nick shrugged his shoulders. "I have no idea. Maybe to his motel? He said he was staying at the roadside." Thanking Nick, Frank decided to talk to someone who knew Howard Foster, Alex's father and Jane's husband. According to neighbor Betty, Howard was friends with a man named Henry Morris, who also worked as an auto mechanic. Henry turned up retired in a small house on the outskirts of town. He was a short, stocky man in his 60s with graying hair and hands calloused from work. When Frank showed him his badge and told him he was investigating Jane's murder, Henry only shook his head. "Poor thing. First Howard, now her. What an unlucky family." "Did you know Howard well?" "We were friends for 15 years until he died. He was a great guy, good hands. The way he fixed cars, you could hear it." "And his wife? Jane?" Henry was quiet for a moment. "You know, I never really understood her. She was strange, kind of friendly, but she was, distant. Howard liked her a lot, but his son Alex didn't like her very much." "Do you know how they met? Jane and Howard?" "Yeah," Howard told me. "It was somewhere in Arizona, Phoenix, I think. He was there on a job, fixing a bus for some company. He went into a cafe and Jane was a waitress. I fell in love at first sight." Henry grinned. He glowed when he talked about her. She moved in with him a month later, and 2 months later they were married. "What about her past? Did Howard say anything?" "Not much. Said she came from some dysfunctional family, left home early, lived in different places, worked odd jobs. She didn't have much of a childhood. Maybe that's why she was always so reserved." "And Alex? Why didn't he get along with his stepmother?" Henry's face darkened. "It's a complicated story. Alex was very attached to his birth mother, Carol. She died of cancer when he was 14. The kid took it pretty hard. And then, a couple years later, Howard brings a new woman. Alex took it as a betrayal. Plus, there was something about Jane that made him suspicious. He said she wasn't real, that there was something lurking behind her smile. That phrase made Frank wary. Not real was an interesting definition for a stepmother. So what happened next? In the end, when Alex was 21, after another big fight, he packed his bags and left. Howard was very worried, tried to contact his son, but he hardly answered. And then Howard died, and Alex was late for the funeral. Henry sighed. Oh, poor Howard. He never made up with his son. Frank pondered the information he'd received. Jane Foster, or Parker, or Wilson, a woman with a murky past, moving from place to place, changing names. What was she hiding? Who was she running from? Back at the department, he requested all available data on Jane Foster before her marriage to Howard. There was surprisingly little information. A birth certificate in the name of Jane Ellen Wilson, issued in Tucson, Arizona, and practically nothing else. No school records, no trace of employment or registration until she married Howard Foster and moved to their town. It was as if before Jane simply didn't exist. That same day, Frank decided to talk to Alex Foster again. He found him at the motel packing up his things. "Leaving?" Frank asked, showing his badge to the security guard who led him into the room. "No, I'm moving into my dad's apartment. I mean Jane," Alex answered, folding his shirt. "The police said it's okay for me to stay there since I'm the next of kin." "How are you feeling?" Frank asked, watching his reaction. Alex shrugged his shoulders. "I don't. It's weird. Jane and I weren't close, but a death like that. You wouldn't wish that on anyone. You were supposed to meet her yesterday at 8 o'clock. Why?" Alex froze for a moment, then continued packing. "I wanted to talk. We haven't talked in years. I thought maybe it was time to reconnect. And that's why you came back to town after 9 years away? Just to reconnect?" "Look, I had my reasons." Alex raised his voice, then visibly pulled himself together. "I'm sorry. It's just this whole thing. Hard. Your friend Nick said that you got some information about Jane that worried you. What was that information?" Alex's face became visibly tense. It was nothing special. Just a letter from a mutual friend saying she wasn't feeling well. I decided to check on her. The lie was obvious, but Frank decided not to push it yet. "Don't you think it's a strange coincidence? You come back to town after a long absence, arrange to see your stepmother, and the same night she's murdered? You think I killed her?" Alex asked bluntly, looking Frank in the eye. "I have an alibi. I was at the bar with Nick until 10:30, and Jane was killed around 9, according to the police. Nick says you stayed in the bar when he left." Alex frowned. "Yeah, I sat for another 20 minutes, no more. Then I went back to the motel. You can ask the receptionist, he saw me come in." "And you didn't go to Jane's?" "No. I told you I canceled. I called her, but she didn't answer, so I left a message on her answering machine. It matched the message we found, but something was still bugging Frank. Mr. Foster, I have to ask straight out. What do you know about your stepmother's past?" Alex's face twitched almost imperceptibly, but Frank could see it. "Nothing much. She never talked about herself. I never asked." "Didn't you find that odd? A woman about whom almost nothing is known suddenly becomes your father's wife?" Alex turned away, pretending to look for something in his bag. "Of course it seemed like it. I never trusted her. But my father was a grown man. It was his choice. Frank decided to come at it from a different angle. You know, I was talking to Tom Riley today. He mentioned that he knew Jane before her marriage to your father. According to him, she introduced herself with a different last name and seemed to be hiding from someone." Alex turned sharply, something akin to alarm flashing in his eyes. "I don't know anything about that. What about the mysterious letter Jane received a month ago? It was from Arizona. Right after that, you decide to come back to town. Coincidence?" Alex went pale. "I don't know about any letter." Frank realized he was bluffing now, trying to get Alex to come clean. He wasn't sure if the letter from the motel and Alex's return were connected, but Alex's reaction suggested he was onto something. "Mr. Foster, I think you're hiding something, and that something may have something to do with your stepmother's murder." "I have nothing more to say," Alex answered firmly. "If you have any more questions, please contact my lawyer." Frank decided to back off. Too much pressure could cause Alex to shut down completely. He left his card and left the room. That evening, Alex moved his belongings into Jane's apartment. After the forensics team had finished their work, the police had lifted the cordon, and he, as the next of kin, was allowed to be there. Inside, there were still signs of what had happened. A dark stain on the floor, marks from the fingerprint powder. Alex slowly walked around the apartment, examining the things that had once belonged to his father and then passed to Jane. There were pictures hanging on the walls. Howard and Jane on their wedding day, the two of them fishing in the backyard of their first home. Alex was nowhere to be found. That night, the Oak Street apartment was quiet. Jane Foster sat in an armchair with her hands around her teacup. The lamp cast a soft light on her face, emphasizing the wrinkles in the corners of her eyes. From the window came the muffled noise of passing cars, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. An ordinary evening in an ordinary town. When the doorbell rang, Jane flinched. She wasn't expecting visitors. The caller was insistent, so she set her cup down on the coffee table, got up, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a familiar face and froze for a moment, then slowly turned the key. The conversation began quietly. Muffled voices, occasionally interrupted by long pauses. Then the tone changed. First disbelief, then surprise, questions, tension. At one point, photographs and documents appeared on the table. Jane turned pale when she saw them. "It was 20 years ago," she said quietly. "Another life, another person." The atmosphere was heating up. The voices grew louder, with notes of anger and despair. Jane tried to explain, her hands trembling as she spoke of her past, of who she had once been and who she had become. "You don't understand," she repeated. "I was always me. I just couldn't live in that body." And then a gunshot rang out, sharp, deafening in the silence of the apartment. Jane recoiled, looking down incredulously at the red stain blurring on her robe. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but instead of words, only a quiet sigh escaped her lips. She took a step back, staggered, and fell, catching the cup in her hand, which shattered on the floor. All that remained in the room was the silhouette of a man standing over her with a gun in his hand. Then the sound of a door closing, footsteps on the stairs, the slam of the front door of the entryway, and silence. Frank Murphy sat in his office for the third hour, poring over the Jane Foster case files. It was deep night outside the window, but sleep was not coming. Something about the case kept him awake, some implicit inconsistency, some elusive detail. He went over again the statements of all the witnesses interviewed. Betty's neighbor who discovered the body and called the police. Jane's co-worker at the motel who told him about the mysterious letter from Arizona. Tom, a bartender who knew Jane back in Albuquerque, where she used a different last name. Alex's friend Nick, who confirmed his alibi. Howard's old buddy who told him about the conflict between father and son. And of course, Alex Foster himself, back in town after 9 years away, arranged a meeting with his stepmother but supposedly never showed up, nervous and evasive under questioning. Something didn't add up. Frank checked the time frame again. Jane was killed around 9 p.m. Alex had been at the bar with a friend until 10:30. Both Nick and the bartender confirmed it. Seemed like an airtight alibi. But something in Tom Riley's testimony made Frank wary. The bartender had mentioned that Alex and Nick had left together, and Nick had claimed to have left alone, while Alex stayed behind. Frank reached for the phone and dialed a number. "Research Department? I need information on James Edward Parker, supposedly from Arizona or New Mexico. Yes, it's urgent." Hanging up the phone, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, reconstructing the details in his mind. The hormones in Jane's bedroom, the regular trips to the doctor in another city, the lack of information about her life before her marriage to Howard. Different last names, Wilson according to documents, Parker according to Tom. Alex's strange behavior at the mention of his stepmother's past. An hour later, the phone rings. "Lieutenant Murphy, we have the information you requested. James Edward Parker, born in Tucson, Arizona, 1970. In 1995, he received a court order to change his name and sex. The new name is Jane Ellen Parker." Frank straightened up in his chair. "Are you sure?" "Positive. The papers have been certified by the court in Maricopa County, Arizona. James Parker officially became Jane Parker. After that, she apparently changed her last name to Wilson. We found the corresponding records." "Thank you." Frank hung up the phone and thought. It was all starting to come together now. Jane was a transgender woman who'd had a sex change over 20 years ago. That explained the hormones, her closetedness, the trips to the specialist, the lack of information about her early life. She had deliberately cut off her past, starting her life anew. But what does that have to do with her murder? And what role does Alex play here? Frank recalled a conversation with Henry Morris, a friend of Howard's. Alex had said that Jane was fake. Maybe he suspected something? Or had he learned the truth and couldn't face it? Suddenly, it hit Frank. The letter from Arizona that Jane had gotten a month ago. Had someone from her past found her and perhaps blackmailed her? Or had simply reported her secret to Alex? He quickly dialed Carol's number from the Pine Motel. "Sorry for the late call. This is Lieutenant Murphy. You mentioned a letter that Jane received. Could it still be in her desk or somewhere in the motel? I don't think so, Carol replied sleepily. She took it with her the same day. She was very upset. Do you remember the exact return address? No, it just came from Phoenix, but… She paused. There was a sender's name on the envelope. I happened to notice it because it seemed odd. R. Tanner, I think. Or T. Runner, something like that. T. Runner or T. Raleigh, Tom Riley, the bartender who claimed to know Jane in Albuquerque. Coincidence? Frank decided to go see Alex again. At this late hour, he had to be at Jane's apartment, where he'd moved this afternoon. Driving up to the house on Oak Street, Frank noticed a light in the windows of apartment number 8. Alex was awake. Going up to the second floor, Frank knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if Alex had been expecting a visitor. Lieutenant? There was a look of surprise on his face. What are you doing here at this hour? We need to talk. Frank entered the apartment without waiting for an invitation. Inside, everything changed. The red stain on the floor was gone, replaced by a new rug. There was an open box on the couch, from which Alex had apparently taken things to hang. I'm going to live here, Alex said, catching Frank's eye. The apartment was his father's, after all, and the motel is expensive. I found out something about your stepmother. Frank decided to go straight. More specifically, about James Edward Parker. Alex's face stiffened. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Frank sat down on the edge of the couch. Jane Foster, born James Parker, had a sex change 20 years ago. A month ago, she received a letter from Phoenix, supposedly from Tom Riley, who he said knew her in Albuquerque. That's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? And shortly thereafter, you're back in town for the first time in 9 years. Alex pressed his lips together tightly, answering nothing. I think the following happened, Frank continued. Tom somehow found out the truth about Jane and decided to get back at her for something. Maybe he blackmailed her, or maybe he just gave that information to you. You went back to town to make sure it was true. And then… You can't prove anything, Alex interrupted him. But there was uncertainty in his voice. Not yet, Frank agreed. But we keep looking, like the gun that was used to shoot Jane, or evidence that your alibi is false. Alex grinned nervously. My alibi is corroborated by 2 people, Nick and Tom. I was at the bar until 10:30. Jane was killed at 9. Elementary math, Lieutenant. Yes, if you believe what they say. Frank nodded. But Tom says you and Nick left together, and Nick says you left alone. One of them is lying, and I think they're both covering for you. Alex went pale. These are unsubstantiated accusations. Maybe, Frank stood up. But I have a witness who saw a man who looks like you entering this driveway around 8:45, and we found fallen leaves near Jane's body, just like the ones on the soles of your shoes. The last was pure improvisation, but Frank watched Alex's reaction carefully. He flinched and cast a brief glance at his shoes at the entrance. Yeah, I went to see her, Alex finally said. But after she was killed, saw the door ajar, went in and found her dead. I was afraid I'd be blamed, so I left. So I didn't say anything to the police. So why did you come if you canceled the meeting? Frank pretended to believe him. Alex turned away to the window. I changed my mind. I thought it would be better to talk right away instead of postponing it. Talk about what? There was a long silence, then a quiet, almost squeezed voice. About what I found out. About James Parker. Frank scrutinized Alex's profile. And how did you find out? Tom. He sent me an email a month ago. Photos of Jane before the surgery. Name change papers. I couldn't believe it. Alex ran his hand through his hair. My father. He was married to a man. He lived a lie his whole life. Are you sure it was a lie? Frank asked. Maybe your father knew the truth and accepted it? Alex turned sharply. No, my father would never. He was a traditional man. If he had known. But you don't know that for sure, Frank remarked. Maybe Jane told him the truth and he decided it didn't matter. He loved her for who she was. Alex shook his head, but there was doubt in his eyes. That's impossible. What makes you so sure of that? Frank paused. What exactly happened that night, Alex? You came to talk to Jane about her past. What did she say to you? Alex sank down on the couch, wrapping his arms around his head. She said that Dad knew, from the beginning, that she'd told him before the wedding and he'd accepted her. Said it didn't matter. His voice shook. But it couldn't be true. She lied to me like she lies to everyone. And if she didn't lie? Frank asked quietly. If your father really knew and accepted her, what then? Alex raised his head, tears in his eyes. He didn't finish the sentence. Then you killed the woman your father loved, Frank finished for him. The woman he accepted for who she was. And you did it because of your own prejudices, not out of love for him. Alex was silent, his shoulders slumped. Frank continued. It's all coming together, Alex. You arranged to meet Jane, but you went to the bar first. You met Nick, told him about Jane, about your suspicions. He agreed to confirm your alibi. You called Jane, told her you weren't coming so she wouldn't expect visitors and get suspicious. And then, when Nick left, you left the bar too, but not through the front door, where Tom could have seen you, probably out the back. You went to Jane, showed her the ID, accused her of lying, and when she told you that your father knew and took her in, you couldn't take it anymore. You pulled out your gun and you shot her. That's not true. Alex's voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. Then you went back to the bar through the back door. Frank continued, reconstructing the picture of events. Tom saw you and realized that you had done something. Or maybe you told him yourself. Anyway, he agreed to confirm that you didn't leave the bar. And what's interesting is, why would he do that? Why would he cover up a murderer? Alex was silent, his head down. I think that Tom had some personal score with Jane, Frank said. Maybe they were close in the past, when she was still James? Or did he find out about her sex change by accident and decided to get revenge for something? Either way, he intentionally sent you information about her, knowing how you would react. He used you as a tool for revenge, Alex. Tom knew her before, Alex said quietly. They worked together at some garage in Albuquerque. Then she disappeared, and the next time he saw her was as a woman with my father. He was shocked, but she asked him to keep quiet. And then, many years later, they had a fight. He threatened to tell the truth. And he decided to get revenge by using you. Frank nodded. He knew of your dislike for your stepmother, your devotion to your father's memory. Figured you wouldn't stand for it when you found out. I didn't mean to kill her, Alex said suddenly, his voice trailing off. I just wanted to talk, to find out the truth. But when she said that her father knew, that he accepted her, I couldn't believe it. It shattered everything I knew about him, all my memories. It was as if the father I remembered never existed. Frank stared at him silently, giving him the opportunity to continue. I took my father's gun with me, an old revolver he kept in the garage. I don't know why I took it, maybe just to scare her, to make her admit that she'd been lying to her father all these years. Alex looked up at Frank. But she wasn't lying. I saw it in her eyes. She was telling the truth, and it was unbearable. You shot her. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Alex nodded slowly. And then you panicked. You ran away, back to the bar where you met Tom, told him what had happened. He offered to confirm that you hadn't left the bar. Nick also agreed to lie for you. Nick didn't know anything, Alex said quickly. He really had left earlier. Only Tom said that he would help me, that Jane deserved it, lying to everyone these years. Frank stood up, pulling out his handcuffs. Alex Foster, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Jane Foster. Alex didn't resist as Frank snapped the handcuffs on his wrists. The confession seemed to bring him some relief. Do you know what the worst part is? He asked as Frank led him to the car. I found a letter from my father to Jane, written just before he died. He really knew everything, and he wrote how grateful he was for her courage to be herself, how he admired her strength, and asked her to tell me the truth someday when I was ready, but I was never ready. Frank sat Alex in the car and slammed the door shut. Dawn was dawning over the city, coloring the sky a pale pink. Another case had been solved. Another truth had come to light. But, as was often the case in his work, that truth brought no relief to anyone. The next day they arrested Tom Riley as an accessory. The bartender did not deny that he had sent the letter to Alex, that he had deliberately provoked the conflict between him and Jane, that he had helped to cover up the traces of the crime. His motives remained not entirely clear, a mixture of old resentment, wounded pride, and perhaps unrequited affection. When Frank was asked about the case later, he always answered the same thing. The most dangerous lie is the one we want to believe. Alex so desperately wanted to believe that his father had been deceived that he couldn't accept the truth. His father knew everything and loved Jane for who she was. That truth shattered the image of his father that Alex had created in his imagination, and he couldn't accept it. And Jane Foster, born James Parker, became another victim of prejudice and misunderstanding, having come a long way to becoming herself, only to be killed by a man unable to accept the other for who he was.